Rejection is awful, and heaven knows I had my share of it in high school, but in my defense, a lot of other guys had mullets too. When we fail at something, the best way to avoid that in the future is to understand what went wrong. So when a fish refuses your fly, why are they rejecting it? Well, we know that presentation matters. That's why we don't tie flies with mullets. But what else makes fish more or less likely to eat your flies? On today's episode of Untangled, we're going to look at the world the way a fish does. We'll talk about the science behind how fish see and perceive your flies, what details they actually notice, and the specific things that trigger them to eat or reject your flies. This is Untangled, fly fishing for everyone, presented by Ventures Fly Co. Hey everybody, welcome to it. This is Untangled, and I am your host, Spencer Durant. I'm really excited about today's show. This stuff absolutely fascinates me. I love diving into the fish's world and trying to think how they think and figure out what makes them tick and what makes them get out of bed every morning. What's their motivation? What's their why? I was asked that question all the time as a teacher. What's your why for being here, Durant? Well, it's a paycheck. That's why. Oh, kidding around, of course. But we're going to take an in-depth look at how trout see the world. And this isn't just something interesting or fun to do. There's a tactical application to it as well. So you are going to learn something, probably more than one thing, that you can take and apply to make your fly fishing and specifically how you present your flies that much better. So there is a tactical element to the discussion today. First thing that we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the science behind how fish see, and then we're going to look at what factors trigger a trout to eat something. So how are they deciding, yes, that's a food item, I'm going to eat that? What goes into that? We'll look into all of that and explain it in detail, and then we'll end with the question that I think all of us want answered. Why do some fish look at the flies and say, not today, you're not fooling me? We'll talk about the rejection and why fish do that. Now, a lot of this information that I'm sharing with you today comes from a long series of articles I've read. There's a lot of science on this subject, and I've linked all those in the show notes, so you can go take a look at them. There's a lot more in those articles than I'm covering in the show today, because it'd be like a 3-hour show if I did that. Anyways, let's get right into it. So, how do fish see? Exactly. What is their vision like when you compare it to the vision of a human? That's a handy baseline because we know how we see. So how do fish see in relation to that? Well, trout can do a few things a lot better than we can, and then they also do a few things worse than we do. So let's look at the things that they do better than us. What areas specifically is their vision better than ours? And the first one of that is going to be their binocular vision. Now, we have binocular vision as humans, but trout take it to a little bit of a next level. What this means is that they are able to focus on food approaching them from the front, but, quote, retain distance, focus in the backward, downward, upward, and lateral directions. This enables the trout to detect and focus on its prey and simultaneously spot approaching predators. And that is a quote from an article Don Stazaker, a British guide and author, wrote. I'll be referencing Stazaker's work quite a bit. He did a wonderful job. So what this means is that a fish can focus on a hatching mayfly and eating those mayflies as they're coming off while still being aware of potential predators that might be out to do that little critter harm, like an eagle or an osprey or an angler. They're aware of me when I'm stomping up to the river, buffalo sauce dripping from my beard. And, yeah, we're going to catch fish today. They're aware of that still because of their binocular vision. And this is why, even when fish are feeding heavily during a hatch, if you've been able to be in that situation, you've probably noticed you can get a little bit closer to the fish in those situations because they lose a little bit of their inhibition compared to if they're just rising to one-off bugs and whatnot. If there's a good hatch going on, you can get a little bit closer. But even then, if you get too close, you will put a steadily eating fish down. That's because of this binocular vision that they've got. They're able to see and sense predators. And again, fish are a prey animal at heart, so they know they've got to get out of the way when us or eagles or osprey come knocking. So that's the first thing that they have better than humans. The next thing is trout. Their eyesight is triggered mainly by movement and contrast. Now, this makes sense when you think about the world that a trout lives in. There's a lot of movement going by. There's always something going and moving through the water. So their eyesight is adapted to make them excel at spotting the right kinds of movement and then contrast. So the right kinds of movement, that could be anything. Bugs fluttering on the surface, the emergers rising up to start hatching on the surface. But often the movement that they are going to be hyper-focused on detecting is the movements of potential predators. Every fish knows how the silhouette of an osprey moves, and they will spot and avoid that in an instant. Even if they've never seen an osprey before in their lives, they know what that's like, and they will scamper because they know that osprey could come and eat them. And by that same token, they know how a drifting mayfly nymph moves compared to a small stick. The movement differences are going to be very subtle, but they know that and they can detect that. All right. Same goes for contrast because, again, with all that movement coming at them and underwater, they've got to be able to pick out against that background of the water different food items that are in that underwater environment. So their eyesight is adapted to really hone in on the items that contrast from the background in the way that their food would. And just one little note about movement. A while ago, I read a story about how osprey have returned to, I believe it was the Deschutes River in Oregon. I hope I'm getting that right. But the fish in the Deschutes have been renowned for they'll feed up on dries, and you can have some great dry fly days in the Deschutes. But ever since the osprey really started to move back in, guides have been talking about how the fish just don't feed on the surface as regularly as they used to because the osprey are out and about. That movement of the osprey in the air is enough. The fish can see that and they'll scamper, they'll hide. So that's how well attuned fish are to spotting that kind of movement. And then the last thing that they are better at than us is trout can see in low light so much better. Staziker, in his article, he wrote, quote, "Trout have better low light vision than humans, and brown and rainbow trout can respond to a light level half of that required by brook and cutthroat trout." So what this looks like in practice is that as light passes through the water, it lessens dramatically in intensity. I think we all understand that. The closer you are to the surface, the more light there is, the deeper you get, the darker it gets. We've all seen Finding Nemo and the creepy anglerfish and whatnot. We understand how that works. But this means, in the context of a river, which usually isn't too deep, okay, that even in off-color or turbid water, or even just fast and turbulent water, fish will be less picky about the fly being an exact match because they can still see in low light, but even with all that other stuff going on, they'll be less picky in those situations. They'll go ahead and eat. But on the flip side of that, that also means that trout can be incredibly choosy when the water is low and clear, there's plenty of light, and they can actually inspect the food items that they're looking at. So those are the areas where trout's eyesight excels compared to humans. Their binocular vision, detecting movement and contrast, and then seeing in low light conditions. Now, to illustrate where the fish don't see as well as we do, I want you to think for a minute about a real life mayfly. Picture its long, slender body, the very fine, wispy tails, the paper-thin, translucent wings, the graceful appearance of the bug. It's all streamlined, it's very compact, it looks beautiful. Now, keep that mayfly in mind, but also bring up a parachute Adams. The body's not as long, it's a little scraggly. The tails are really thick compared to the tails on a mayfly. The wings are replicated with this stiff hackle. They're not translucent. But a well-tied parachute Adams, it's still graceful and pretty in its own way. So if fish have good eyesight like we've already established, how can a trout think that a parachute Adams is actually a mayfly? Are we just chucking fried cauliflower dipped in sauce at them and hoping they'll think it's a buffalo wing? Is it like me slipping Diet Coke into Alex's bottle when he's not looking to see if he'll notice that it's not Coke Zero? All right, kidding aside, the ability of a fish to see a parachute atoms and conclude it's a real mayfly comes down to a trout's visual acuity, or the clarity and sharpness of its vision. That's what acuity means. A rainbow trout has the visual acuity that's 1/14 of what a human eye has, according to Don Staziker. So what that means is that even upon close inspection, trout do not see the same level of detail that we do. They'll see 1/14 of that detail. That's kind of astounding when you really think about it, especially considering how much time you can spend on some flies, making them look incredibly lifelike. Now, to illustrate this, I actually found an article from 35 years ago. I've linked to this in the show notes as well, where Gordon Burns, he was an actual ophthalmologist. He was able to simulate and take pictures of exactly what a trout sees compared to the human eye on the visual acuity spectrum. So showing you what detail you would see as a human versus what detail the trout is actually going to see. And because Alex is the greatest fella on the planet, he put together a graphic of this illustration so you can see what I mean if you're watching the podcast. But what it boils down to is that trout's vision is the sharpest, and they get the clearest picture of a fly when they are 3 inches away from it. That's why you'll see fish rise, examine your fly. They might even follow it for a few feet before they finally decide to just go ahead and eat it. Okay, even at 3 inches, though, as you can see in this graphic, and if you're not watching, that's fine, the trout still don't see every little detail in the fly. At 3 inches, they've got a very good idea of the shape and the proportions. They can see segmentation, but they can't see all the fine details. Where we can see some of the scraggly pieces of dubbing, where we can see all the individual hackle points, where we can see maybe we can see the tie-in point where the wing is on the dry fly. That all is still a little out of focus for a trout. It's like when you hold your thumb really close to your face and you don't focus on it, you're focusing on something further away from you. You can still see your thumb and you know it's there. You know what it is because you know what your thumb looks like. But if you focus on it, then it comes into sharp focus. The trout can't ever get it into that sharp of focus. Okay. Beyond 3 inches, the flies get more and more blurry as the fish's visual acuity diminishes. The size and shape are still discernible at like 6 inches and at 12 inches, but the finer details are completely lost at that point, and they just see vague shapes. So when you're fly fishing, let's say you're out throwing dries and your dry fly hits the water and a fish takes it almost immediately, which that can happen to you sometimes. It's tons of fun when the fishing's that fast. But what that means is that fish saw only the blurriest shape of the fly, decided it was real, and ate within a matter of seconds, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. So we've now got the basis for how trout see. Blurry until they're close to the bug. Okay, we understand they've got great vision elsewise, but blurry unless they get within 3 inches of the fly, and even then, it's still not all the detail that you'd like to see. But what specifically triggers the trout to eat? What is it about that slightly blurry image that makes the fish go, oh yeah, I'm going to eat that. That looks good. I'm going to do it. Well, fish decide to eat largely based on pattern matching. And the best way I found to explain this is a quote from John Merwin. He wrote an article about the subject back in 2011. And he just put this into words exceptionally well. He said, quote, trout learn by experience. A mayfly or other intense hatch is a collection of quickly repeated experiences with identical insects. Trout key in on that repeated identity, which allows for more efficient feeding because the trout's brain is able to establish a narrowly defined searching image. That searching image, as used in short-term feeding on dozens of identical blue-winged olive mayflies, for example, depends on a series of positive matches made by the trout almost simultaneously. Right color, right size, right shape, and so on. It does not, for the most part, depend on negative matches. A hook, something that's not supposed to be there, would be a negative match. The natural insects on which the trout has rapidly learned to selectively feed don't have hooks. Hooks are not part of the trout's developed searching or matching image. Therefore, in grossly oversimplified form, trout don't care about the hook. That's pretty astounding as well, if you think about it. How the fish see. It's pattern matching, looking for positive matches and then going ahead and eating and then discarding the negative ones. Trout are looking for patterns that match what they expect to see. So if your flies match that pattern, they'll move to eat that likely without a second thought. That's why you can get takes that feel almost instant when your flies hit the water or when your nymphs. I mean, how many of you think about it? How many of you have ever had that instance where you throw your nymphs and they don't even sink? The fish eat them on the drop. It's because they made that match and ate within just a second of those bugs coming into their field of view. Now, there's an exception to this because there's an exception to everything in fly fishing. That's just the way it goes, where fish, they do have the ability to learn what separates real bugs from fake ones. Now, Don Staziker, in his article, he shared this anecdote that I thought did a wonderful job of explaining this particular issue. He said, quote, "I have often had trout swim 5 feet to inspect my gold beadhead scud, only to stop dead at around 3 inches and refuse to take the fly. The gold bead was the negative aspect of the fly. I determined this because I changed to a pattern identical in every respect except it had a black bead and caught the same fish. This took place on a river that receives a lot of pressure and where many anglers use gold beads. The first fly looked good enough when the fish saw it at 5 feet. It came over to investigate further, but once it could see the fly more clearly, it didn't like it." Now, at first glance, it might seem like that story from Staziker and Merwin's little anecdote about negative and positive pattern matching contradict each other because fish ignore the hook because they just don't pay attention to it. Everything else matches and they eat, but a gold bead versus not a gold bead. Why would they do that? Well, it's not so much that it's the bead. Okay, what we're to understand here is that it was the color of the bead. The real scuds in that river must have had darker heads. Therefore, when the fish gets close enough to it, they can look at it and realize, oh no, the color's off, and they're going to move ahead and not eat. Because if they were looking at the whole fly and making negative matches, which we know they don't, but if they did, they saw that the hook sticking out the bottom of the scud, they wouldn't eat our flies ever if that were the case. It comes down to color in that situation, but it just goes to show how fish can learn and implement some of that into their pattern matching. And just to drive this point home a little bit further, because I understand this can be a little tough to grasp, is that last year, Alex and I spent the whole year filming our fly selection masterclass, which is out on YouTube now. I'll throw a link to it in the show notes. But one of the things that we did is we filmed a ton of hatching insects and we filmed us fishing in slow-mo, 120 frames per second in 4K. So we can count the freckles on a blue-winged olive's wings if they had freckles on their wings. They don't, but if they did, we could count them. That's how HD we filmed this stuff in. And we were out on the Green River in Utah fishing the blue-winged olive hatch, one of the biggest hatches of the year. And there were multiple moments where we would throw out our fly and the fish would come up and get half an inch from it. Look like it's all ready to eat it and then just swim away and go about their business, not eating my flies, because that was a picky fish, been educated from a very highly pressured tailwater, very highly pressured piece of water. And what we're to assume is that fish finally saw something that made it think, oh, no, this isn't real, and scampered off. Okay, this does happen where they will see something that tells them no, but they're looking for positive pattern matching, and they're very good at it. Their entire diet depends on their ability to do that. So what we should conclude from all of this discussion about pattern matching and whatnot is that size and shape matter immensely. That's why you can be fishing to a rising trout that ignores everything you throw at it. You've thrown every fly, thrown the kitchen sink. You started swearing. You said, I'm never going to go fly fishing again. You're getting grumpy. Your fishing buddy's gone away because he don't want to be around you anymore. You're not in a good place. And then you finally just give in and you go a size smaller and you catch that fish on the next drift immediately. Okay. That tells you right then and there that size and shape are so important because, again, trout are matching patterns, and especially during a hatch, they are going to reject things that don't fit that pattern. Now, are they going to do that 100% of the time? No. There will be instances where there's something hatching and you can throw a 5-inch hippie stomper out there, a big old foam fly, and they might just eat that anyways. Sometimes they just do. But the vast, vast majority of the time, they're going to be feeding with this pattern matching. I almost called it software. They're not cyborg trout. They're going to be feeding with that pattern matching criteria in mind. Now, you've probably noticed there's one thing we haven't really talked about yet so far as what's going to trigger a fish to actually eat, and that would be color. I've specifically saved color for the end here because what we've learned is that color plays an absolutely microscopic role in whether a trout eats your fly. Now, to this, you might say you might have some personal experience where purple flies always work, or I always catch fish when I use this color of dubbing. And that might be true for you. I'm not taking away from that at all. But I firmly believe that's an instance of correlation not being causation. Kind of like me, where just because I eat a ton of wings, it doesn't mean it's the wings that are making me fat, right? I can keep eating them, right? Well, I almost guarantee there's another reason beyond color that trout always eat your special colored flies, whether it's purple or green or whatever it is. And trout don't always eat a specific pattern anyways. We know that magic flies like that don't exist. But there's some interesting science on this subject. For that, we're going to turn to Dr. Keith Jones. He's a scientist for Berkeley and Pure Fishing, one of the biggest fishing conglomerates out there. And he said that trout and bass react to prey items based on size, shape, and movement. Color is a very distant fourth factor for both species, although trout are more sensitive to color, and color is going to matter the most where the light is the strongest and the color is most visible, which would be at the surface. So in dry fly fishing situations, there are times when a specific color is an absolute must, where you really will notice a difference between throwing the dark olive versus light olive, blue-winged olive mayfly. Now, those instances are rare, and they don't happen all the time. You're usually going to see that on the highly pressured tailwaters, the green in Utah, the frying pan, or the South Platte in Colorado, the Henry's Fork in Idaho, where that really does make that much of a difference. Now, to quote Dr. Jones directly, he said, quote, "There are some instances when color could play a secondary role in determining whether a trout or bass hits a fly. A fish may learn to look for certain visual image, such as those of a local crayfish or minnow when it feeds. A certain color pattern could make an image signature, so to speak, to help a fish identify a creature as prey. But keep in mind that fish don't have emotional attachments to certain color like humans do. We shouldn't be so focused on what color our flies should be. Again, though, trout are more likely to be color focused than a black bass, only in the sense that trout can see a broader spectrum of colors." So there it is, directly from the mouth of a scientist. Color really doesn't matter very much. What trout can discern most, even though they can discern color, what they really can discern most is contrast. So your flies need to stand out from the background to help fish detect it as a food item. That's why we get some of these crazy colors. That's why hotspots on flies are so popular now, because that grabs the fish's attention. And I'd wager that's why UV dubbing works so well, especially on nymphs, because down lower, it's going to catch what little light there is, reflect it, and that is going to get a trout's attention. It's going to give it some contrast. And as long as it's the right size and shape, It could be fuchsia. For all the trout cares, it's going to go over and take a little snack right there and have itself a nice little meal. So with all of this information at hand, what are we to conclude? Why would a fish reject our fly? Well, at its simplest, it really just comes down to patterns. Trout are going to reject the flies that don't match the size and shape of the bugs currently available to them, to the patterns that the trout are expecting to see. We can also deduce that the movement of the fly matters, whether that's the drift of a dry fly, making a drag-free drift, or a good drag-free drift on your nymph. But what we know for sure is that color is the least important item to consider. And we've talked about this a lot at VFC, where worry about size and shape. If you can match the color, great. If not, don't worry about it. Fish that fly anyways, because the size and shape are just hugely important to fish. So we're going to end with this little example. Let's say that you're out fishing dries and a fish refuses your dry fly. It comes up, follows it for a few feet, but then it sinks back down and says, not today, buddy. Well, the fish saw the shape of your fly. It came to investigate and it found something wrong with it. What should you do? At this point, what I would do is I would assume that the size and shape are wrong. So I'm going to look for some naturals to see how well my fake fly imitates the real thing. Often when this is the case, I've gone a size too big. I usually err on the size of too big, and I should go a size smaller than what I usually pick out of my box. So if it's really close, if you get it fixed and you get the size and shape, you match them very well, and you're still getting rejections, then you should look at color, at that, or not color, pardon me. Then you should look at your fly's movement, whether there's any drag. That's what you should be looking for next. Are you getting that drag-free drift? Could there be micro drag? Do you need to lengthen your leader a little bit? Go down in leader size. That's what you should look at. If you've got the size and shape, you've got the presentation, then if all of that checks out, that's when you go to color. Most often, though, the issue is going to be with your presentation or how the fly is moving on the water. Perfecting your presentation is going to put far more fish in the net than any large collection of flies ever will. You could have 4,000 flies in your bag with you on the river, but at most, you can only fish 3. So all the colors in the world don't really matter if your size and your shape aren't correct. Dial those in first, dial the presentation in, then move on to the color. And I guarantee if you do that, and you remember how fish see and how they match things, and that it doesn't need to be perfect, especially if you tie your own flies. They need to look good, but they don't need to be completely lifelike, because at the end of the day, the fish aren't going to see and discern that. Now, it might look cool and it might be fun to tie, but you really don't need it. There's a reason the Parachute Adams works so stinking well and has worked so well for so long, because it matches the size and shape of what the fish expect. So I hope y'all found something helpful out of that. I hope you learned something from that. I learned a ton putting this portion of the show together this week. It was a lot of fun, and we are ready to move on to the Q&A section of the show. So don't go anywhere, folks. We've got some great questions coming up this week.
Anglers are always asking, what bugs are hatching right now? And that's why we put together a year-round hatch chart. It outlines all the major bug hatches so you always know what fly to tie on, no matter where you're fishing or what time of the year. So if you want to level up your skills and start catching more fish, click or tap the link in the show notes to get this free hatch chart. All right, back to the show.
Every week here at Untangled, we spend half the show directly answering questions from viewers and listeners just like you. So if you've got a question that you would like answered, please go ahead and send that in to us. There is a link to do that in the show notes. We love your questions. We need them. They are what keeps this show running. And our first question this week comes to us. Max from Ontario, Canada, writes in and says, "Hey guys, I'm a beginner fisherman looking to get into fly fishing. I am seriously thinking about buying your Weekend Warrior kit, but I had a question on the flies that come with it. Are these flies dedicated to certain states in the U.S., or can they translate over to Canadian waters fine? Again, I am a complete beginner and unsure on if the flies will work for me. Thanks." Well, Max, this is a good question. So are the flies in our collection, are selected with universal application in mind. So you could take them to fish in Canada. Alex fished some of them in Europe this last summer. I fished them up in Alaska. Anywhere you find trout and bass, these flies are going to work for you just fine. Now, the reason that these flies are going to work for you just fine is actually kind of cool. It's pretty simple too. The aquatic insects and trout streams, and they're generally the same all around the world. So there might be flies that are regionally unique. Like here in the West, in my corner of the West anyways, we get some salmon flies. And then out in the Midwest, you've got the Hexagenia mayflies, the giant sons of gun mayflies. But your usual offerings of caddis, mayflies, midges, scuds, and sow bugs are going to work just about anywhere that you find trout, because these are the bugs that occur in rivers around the world and in a lot of lakes too. So that's just what the aquatic insect base looks like. And the biggest difference, other than the regionally unique flies like I just discussed, is that you will find the timing of certain hatches is going to be different from area to area. A good example of that would be I get a blue-winged olive mayfly hatch very early in the year up here where I live, and Alex doesn't get his until almost a month and a half after I get mine. And then I also get a ton of trichos up here. A ton of trichos, and they hatch for a lot longer than the trichos down in Utah, down where Alex lives. But I also don't get anywhere near as many salmon flies as Idaho and Montana do, just 3 or 4 hours west of me. They get way more than I do. So you think 3 or 4 hour drive, that's not a huge difference, but that's how regional some of these things can be. If you really need some region-specific information on your aquatic insects, the best resource for that's going to be a fly shop. They've got the pulse of the local areas. They can point you in the right direction. But there's also the chance as well that your provincial government will have something. The whatever agency is in charge of fish and game in your area, they probably have some sort of resources on what aquatic insects are available, so you can go check with them as well. And then I will also throw a link to our fly collections in the show notes in case anyone wants to give them a look. But thanks again, Max, for your question. I really appreciate it. Silas from Alberta, Canada, has our next question, writes in and says, I live in Canada, and my New Year's resolution was to try and fly fish minimum once a week this year, as I have recently moved closer to year-round fishable waters. I had thought Saturdays might be my day to go. However, this Saturday, it's supposed to be negative 18 Celsius, or in freedom units, 0. So this begs the question, is there a temperature that is just simply too cold to fish? This is also relevant to the fact that we can get down to the negative 40s and 50s later on in the year. Well, Silas, first off, thank you for converting over from gibberish into freedom units. It's greatly appreciated. It helps everybody understand what you're actually talking about. I appreciate it, man. Thank you. That's 2 questions in a row from Canada, too. There we go. Well, I've had my fair share of fishing in the absolute frigid temperatures lately. Last week, I went out fishing. It was supposed to snow. I love fishing as it's snowing, as long as it's not too windy. It's so quiet. It's very peaceful, and it's just a very unique experience. If you get that opportunity, go do it. Go fish in the snow, in the freshly falling snow. It really is just hard to beat how much fun that can be. But the forecast said it was supposed to be mid-20s with no wind. So I said, all right, I can handle that. Bundled up, went down to the river. It's snowing. It's doing what it should. But then the wind picked up just enough to where I got one cast out, and my line guides froze solid with ice that quickly. I think I made 4 or 5 casts total, and my hands were so cold I couldn't even tie my knots. It took me 20 minutes to tie one of my flies on because my fingers were so numb. And at that point, I just said, I don't care that it took me an hour to get here. I'm going home. And I just packed up and left because it was just too cold. And then the next day, I thought, well, it's not snowing. It'll be a little bit warmer. So I went down to the river, and it was a tiny bit warmer, but the wind picked up again. It does. It does that here. It's windy. And it was so cold that my reel froze. It wasn't even wet, but my reel just wouldn't move. The spool wouldn't move on the frame. I finally got it to move, but the issue was my hands actually stuck to the reel. Like you see in Christmas Story when the kid sticks his tongue to a flagpole, same problem. And then the reel was so cold that it also stuck to my waders. And then it was still so cold that my indicator froze solid to my fly line. And then, of course, my fly line froze solid in the guides. I did end up catching one fish on that trip. I got everything ice-free enough for like 2 drifts, and I caught a little rainbow. So I didn't get skunked, but it was so cold that I just bagged it and went home. So what I'm really getting to with both of those stories is that anything below freezing, so 32 in freedom units or 0 in gibberish units, is tough sledding. It's going to be tough. I used to go fish when it was 10 degrees Fahrenheit outside, but I don't know if I'm just getting soft in my old age or what, but that's just too cold for me to handle anymore. I'm personally not fishing if the temps are supposed to be below 20, and there can't be any wind on those days either. Otherwise, that wind chill kicks up and it makes everything ice up even more. It cuts through you. You start to get a little frostbite on your nose. It's just not a pleasant experience to be in. 20 is my personal cutoff, but it also might be different for other folks as well. My suggestion is go out and see what you're comfortable in. But when things start freezing on every cast, that's when I just say, okay, I can come back tomorrow. I can come back when it's warmer. I'm going to go home. But that's an interesting question, Silas. Thank you so much for sending it in. Our next question is from Daniel from Canada. That is 3 Canadian questions in a row. I believe that is an Untangled first, so that's kind of cool. We got a good listenership up there in Canada. Top of the morning to you, eh? Wait, that's Scottish. I shouldn't have said anything. Oh my gosh. I'm going to get canceled now, aren't I? Oh, top of the morning. It's not Scottish either. It's Irish. I can't get anything right. Oh, well, Daniel from Canada wrote in and said, I am brand new to fly fishing and trying to understand the difference between a nymph pattern and nymph imitations. Are all nymphs sinking flies, or are there nymph flies that sink and nymph imitations that are still considered a dry fly? Thanks for the show. It's been a great help learning my way through all this. Daniel, it's a great question. We just did an episode last week all about wet flies, and I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for you. That will help you out with telling flies apart as well, because they are another type of fly. But to directly answer your question, a nymph pattern and a nymph imitation, those are the same things. Different fly patterns can be called different fly imitations. Pattern and imitation, they are interchangeable terms, right? So all nymphs are designed to sink. Yes, you got that part right. They are meant to imitate the version of aquatic insects before they hatch into their winged adults. So they are meant to look like the bugs that are swimming around under the rocks and on the branches and whatnot in the river. Because the aquatic insect life cycle, they start out as eggs on the bottom of the river. They hatch and they go into their larva or pupa stage, depending on what they are, and they hang out around there. And our nymphs are meant to imitate those larva and pupa stages of their life cycle. And then when they're ready to become the winged adult that flies out and above the water, they turn into an emerger, which shoots up to the surface and tries to get its wings ready and dry. And then once they've completely emerged out of that nymphal shuck, then they are the done or the adult version of the fly. Then they go off, they mate, they come back to the water, lay their eggs, and die, and the cycle starts all over again. So your nymphs are imitating the underwater versions of those flies at that point in their life cycle. So hopefully that clears that up for you, and hopefully nobody holds my awful cultural problems against me. That was funny. Hope you guys were as amused by that as I was. And with that, folks, that is the end of the Q&A section this week. But don't go anywhere, because we've got the Live Real Life moment coming right up. Every week, we end the show by sharing a story and some pictures from the folks out there in the VFC audience who are on the water, living real life, having fun, catching fish, or just even enjoying being out there. If you've got a live real life moment that you would like to share, there's a link to send yours in the show notes. And this week's live real life moment comes from Russ B. Writes in and says, "The first time I fished up in the Uintas changed my fly fishing life forever. Made the 3.5-hour drive with my fishing mentor. Just thinking back about fishing that tiny little stream deep in the wilderness still amazes me to this day. I remember thinking at the time I may never fish a river again. The scenery and environment was absolutely breathtaking. As you can see by the picture, fishing it was incredibly challenging, especially for a relative newbie. Between the growth over and along the sides of the stream and the boulders all over the place and the fallen trees every 10 feet and, well, you get the picture. And don't forget about the hump out bushwhacking through a wildly overgrown forest for what seems like, and sometimes is, miles, hoping you'll somehow make it back to your car without the aid of search and rescue. I have been in the Uintas many times now and am still moved by the experience. Every time, no fail. I only have a 9-foot 5-weight, so I usually leave the fly rod at home and go tenkara when I'm up there. I just love landing those incredibly colorful and beautiful wild trout on a tenkara rod. Bringing in a 7-incher on tenkara feels like you're fighting a 21-inch brown. And they eat up there. Boy, do they eat. You can't stop them from smashing your fly even if you wanted to. I'm getting older now. I've been thinking that I won't be able to access these streams forever. There will be a point, and it's probably sooner rather than later, when I just won't physically be able to do it anymore. And that's a sad thought. But when those thoughts creep in, I remind myself to enjoy every amazing moment in the present. So here we are, 6 years removed from that very first stream. I've had the good fortune of being able to fish some incredible places, but as wonderful as all of those experiences have been, I don't think anything will ever top my first time in the Uintas. Wow, that day. What a beautiful and significant and pivotal day it was. Capturing moments like this should be the reason we do this in the first place, right? Right. Oh, that was a great story, Russ. Thank you for sending that in. That was good. The Uinta Mountains in Utah are really a special place. There's some wonderful fly fishing back in there. I've got some great memories in there myself, and some not so great memories too, getting food poisoning 10 miles away from the truck. Oh, but anyways, thank you so much for sending that question and painting that picture and sharing those memories with us. You didn't send a question, and you sent in a live real life moment, and thank you for sending that. I really appreciate it. And with that, folks, we are going to end the show this week. Thank you so much for being here with us, listening to the end. It helps us out more than you know. And if you'd like to help us out even more, if you haven't already, please rate and subscribe to the show wherever you do it. The more ratings and subscriptions we get, the more folks we can reach and help live real life. Have a great day on the water. And speaking of living real life, we've got tons of other content that'll help you catch more fish. You can click on all the links that you see. And until next week, everybody, get out on the water, but don't freeze, and live real life.